Like if someone's trying to pump the stats there, they're not trying hard enough.
Sure. Okay. And last
It's
question.
too bad to be lying, basically.
Yeah, if you're lying about 300 users, I'm like, I don't think you understand how this market works.
On this episode, we were talking with Andrew Hong from Dune. This was a really fun conversation. We talk about the most cursed Dune dashboards. We talk about some surprising stats on Solana. We also talk about how Dune is dealing with off-chain data like intents and account abstraction, which is really interesting. Kevin, I'm curious if there's anything else that stood out to you.
Yeah, I like what he had to say around interacting and interfacing with GPT and trying to abstract away complexity for the user that is creating a dashboard or creating like a query. They just have such a vast, like complicated pool of data that they get to like interface with users, and using AI to do some of that. It seems like they're doing a lot of really cool stuff there. So yeah, I agree. This is such a great conversation.
Beautiful. All right, let's jump into it. We are here with Andrew Hong, who is the headmaster at Dune. We're not entirely sure what headmaster entails, but I think we're going to find out today. Andrew, thank you for coming on the pod.
Of course. Happy to be here. Excited to talk everything data.
Hell yes. Well, I'm very excited to get into new types of data on and off chain and how you're thinking about what that means for Dune and accessibility of public or private blockchain more broadly. But before we do that, maybe you can give a little bit of background on how the hell you got into crypto.
Yeah. I mean, I think I was part of the COVID/DeFi summer wave for the most part. So I worked in banking before I joined crypto, specifically like mortgage-backed securities, which I know gets a bad rap, but there's still some interesting stuff happening there. But yeah, COVID came around, had a lot more free time. DeFi summer was happening, got involved with ETH Global thanks to Linda Shi and also Trent. Did a few hackathons and was like, this is a lot more fun than trying to do like covenants and random deals in the traditional finance space. And I feel like it's like as soon as you start building and like getting the bug and meet like a few people in the space, you're like, okay, yeah, this is like a no-brainer. So yeah, just started with a bunch of freelancing, and then I feel like you just end up getting pulled deeper and deeper. And now I'm like fully disconnected from the traditional world. Like, I don't think I know how to work in like a normal company anymore.
The reality distortion field is in full effect.
Oh my God, for sure.
Yeah, and then you worked at Consensus for a bit as well.
Yeah, LinkedIn tells me we had overlap at Consensus.
Did we? Okay.
Yeah. I was on the Truffle team. Which team were you on?
I see. I joined like right after there was like the split, but I was on like the Codify side. So I was working there as a business analyst because I couldn't decide, like, do I want to be more on the engineering side or more on the product side of things? So I was like, all right, let me start in the middle. But yeah, that was private blockchains. It's a good time, but very quickly moved on.
Yes. And then you went to Mirror, where you were a data scientist. So I'm very curious, what does it actually mean to be a data scientist somewhere like Mirror, which is a consumer application?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's changed a lot. And since I joined them and like where crypto in general is now, I think when I joined, it was still very much more like data engineering is the focus. That's like something you still have in Web 2 or finance or anywhere else, where like any data science role, for the most part, you're going to be doing a shit ton of data engineering. So just figuring out how to like cleanly index and decode any set of contracts on mainnet. Doing optimism was a lot harder because like with mainnet, you get, back then it was like 15 or 18 seconds. So like your infrastructure doesn't have to be that optimized. But once you start doing stuff like optimism, it's like, all right, now we have to get some like real-time infra in. So honestly, a lot of my job internally was that. Obviously more externally, it was just a bunch of like fun Dune dashboards and whatnot. But I can't really say that made up the chunk of my work.
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious in the context of some of that stuff. I feel like when I think about data scientists in the context of on-chain applications and organizations, I often think about it in the context of DeFi, whereas like to your point, Mirror is a consumer app, but also like you start to deal with these things like speed of indexing and all of this stuff. I'm curious how you navigated sort of balancing some of these like optimization of infrastructure and being like, okay, well, people are using a Web3 application, so they're kind of expecting things to be slow. Like what did that sort of assessment look like?
I see. For the most part, it was fine to have a delay on indexing. I think where it did play roles, like back when we were doing like crowd funds and auctions and all of that, and like there was a reality where things would mint out. We kind of technically had our own like intense thing where like if someone clicks that they want to sign, like submit a transaction for a mint, we'll kind of count a marker of like, hey, decrease the number of available mints, even if it hasn't gone on chain yet. So there was this kind of like Web2 basically commitment, optimistic commitment. So people aren't trying to mint things when it's potentially already minted out. That part, I didn't build that, but that's something that we did build that was more complex, especially because like the main thing you deal with was like reorgs. You don't have that in Optimism, but at least for like back when we were minting things on mainnet, that was an issue.
And then I guess in that situation, like the optimistic minting, you then have to account for the scenario where the mint doesn't actually go through. So you have to like go,
there's like a
remove it from the, or add it back to the pile.
Yeah. So basically the flow is just like check if they signed the transaction, check if it finalized or if it failed. If it failed, remove the count. If it passed, do nothing, basically.
That's kind of an interesting dynamic also in the context of like when I think about what's required for on-chain applications to hit consumer scale, I do think part of it is like this speed. And so I'd be curious how you felt about and what the learnings were in terms of kind of having like two simultaneous systems going on, one where you're tracking what's actually going on chain and one where you're tracking like a sort of user side of things. Like, do you think that that is going to emerge as a best practice? Were there things about it that created a ton of tech debt that ended up being challenging? I'm curious about learnings from running that type of architecture.
When we built that more like optimistic signing architecture, that was more when we were transitioning to Optimism. So we were already treating a bunch of our tech debt from the old indexer. Basically, we moved to like a subscription-based like WebSocket instead of like querying block by block. Like querying block by block only really works on mainnet. It doesn't work on there's the whole thing of like Optimism at the time, each transaction was its own block. So if you queried for like block header or whatnot, like it would be an insane number of queries to then be like, oh yeah, there were 1,000 transactions. Now get block receipts for each one. Like Node RPCs weren't really and still aren't really built for that kind of thing where like you can only get receipts for a certain number of blocks. I think I forgot who, someone was tweeting about like, oh, most providers, you can only get like 10,000 blocks of history, which sounds like a lot, but if you're on like a very fast chain, that's actually not that much. So yeah, we took that all into consideration when building the indexer. There were small tweaks over time. I don't think there were huge changes we made since then. I think the subscription thing worked fine with the optimistic thing. I think this shows up in a lot of apps today still, and I think this is like one of the reasons we still have very simple interfaces. It's just like just managing whatever main action is happening is hard enough. So like for Uniswap or whatnot, you keep your interface very simple. And if there is enhanced data that you can get, you probably just put that on like info.uniswap.com, because trying to add that to the interface, if there's any kind, like there's so many little delays that can happen, which will then like make you question like, wait, why is this figure not exactly matching here? So if you try to keep things optimistic the whole way down, like let's say Uniswap wanted to show pool liquidity or something in the interface, that might be hard because you don't really know all the other swaps coming in. Even if you made it optimistic on like this one person's swap, there's all these people not using your interface to do the swap, So it's like, all right, you're better off not showing that extra information. But then you end up with applications that look super simple. They all have just a mint button, just a swap button, and that's it. They're like, all right, that's it. That's all the data you get.
So there's like, you got to suss out the difference between all of the complicated stuff that you want to account for and like get analytics on, and then the source of truth for like what's actually happening on chain. How much of your time would you say was split between infrastructure, building stuff like this optimistic mint that you were describing, and just like general data analytics? I'm imagining in like a DeFi context, the analytics you want to find out are things like TVL, but in like a mirror context, it's probably very different. So like, what does that even look like?
Yeah. I mean, I think the data engineering side was really only maybe 30 or 40%. I think what took time was just building it in different contexts over and over again. Like building it once in like TypeScript for it to work with the front end stuff, because our front end obviously was already written in TypeScript. I already had stuff written in Python more for like actual data warehousing. So like Python into Databricks. That was a separate setup because I wanted to ingest more data than just like the business critical data. So like that was a separate setup. And then obviously as a consumer app, I was very interested in like graph data science. So there's something called Neo4j that makes it easy for me to query like, hey, I want to see all the relationships of different actions between Chase and Kevin on Mirror. Like who are the people that are contributing to both of you guys? What are the common pathways and whatnot? How closely tied are your communities? So then that requires then ingesting the data into Neo4j using a language called Cypher, which is still not super widely used in crypto. Maybe Chainalysis uses it. I actually don't know what they use for their like graph data science like stack. I'm very curious on it. But yeah, so I basically had to build those up 3 times and then do an analytics across. Like with what remaining time I had was then analyzing across those and trying to figure out like, is there some sort of like stickiness of communities and whatnot?
Interesting. And I guess in the context of what you're doing now,
right?
Dune surfaces a ton of information, which feels like a very good transition into some of your work there. I have lots of things that I know we want to cover on Dune, but for people who like are not familiar, I can't really imagine not being familiar with it. But for anyone who isn't, maybe you can give a brief overview of Dune.
Yeah, for sure. So Dune, it started out more as like an analytics platform. Just take any on-chain data, like the data you see on Etherscan, and imagine you can run SQL queries on it and create basic dashboards. Like it literally started as like a Metabase reskin. Obviously, as time has evolved, there's been a lot of focus on like making it like more of like a community data platform, so people can build models together. Like for example, one of our popular tables is NFT trades, which is all the trades across like OpenSea, SudoSwap, Blur, whatever other ones there are on like all these chains, even Solana chains. There's like 400 contributors across the community who work together to build up even just that single model. So that becomes more of a platform. And then you have the API that gets added on. And there's all these other more like data warehousing features now being added to move it away from just being like, hey, Dune is just for dashboards. It's now like, hey, okay, let's like, how do we get your data into Dune? How do we best support building those community tables? How do we best support getting it into like we have like Optimism uses us in like Airtable for like a CRM integration, like how do we do more stuff like that? So the surface area is extremely wide now.
So if the high level take is like an SQL interface to on-chain data that's now transitioned into like a community data platform, what would the one level deeper architectural overview of Dune look like? What are the moving pieces that's happening under the hood to enable all of that?
Yeah. So for the most part, we get our data from node providers. So we use QuickNode specifically to ingest all of our raw chain data. The main things we need are like logs, transactions, and then traces. It's kind of like the same data across all chains. There is sometimes slowness in like, for example, like when Optimism is rolling up, it's like, okay, like they have to fork Geth and then rebuild the traces endpoint for their thing specifically. So there's sometimes difficulty and delays in like maintaining those RPCs. Thankfully, we don't have to maintain them, but that is a consideration for us. Once things are in raw tables, one of the big things we offer is decoding. So submit any address and the ABI, or we'll pull it from Etherscan if it's there, and we'll decode the ABI into like human readable tables, so like the Uniswap swap, like amount 0 is a column, amount 1 is a column, like the pool is a column. I forget what other variables are in there, but that becomes its own table, so it's much easier to query. The thing I was talking about with like the community data platform side of like Spellbook, it's really just DBT, which is data build tool. It was like a popular ETL tool that came up a few years ago, and it's really good for just basically writing your pipelines completely in SQL. A lot of people used to write them in a mix of different languages, mainly Python and whatnot, but it's much easier if you can just write your pipelines completely in SQL. So that's used on the DBT side. Obviously now with like ingestion and API, the stack gets even more complicated of like if Reservoir wants to send us data, or if like Flashbots wants to send us data for the community to use, then those tools get a lot more one-off, but you can kind of just think about it like Airbyte.
When you say like when Flashbots wants to send you data, you're referring to off-chain data, like mempool specific data?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. So like either the mempool data directly or like mostly their cleaned mev booths data on like, hey, these were the arbitrage, these were sandwiches. Like they have some sort of like enhanced labeling. So it's not just like, we don't have like every single mempool transaction from like block native or whatnot, because that's just an insane amount of data to capture right now. But yeah, Flashbots literally just dumps the files in AWS.
And so, like, what is Flashbots or other teams' incentive that have this off-chain data and they want to make it accessible to anyone? Like, why do you find teams like that are willing to like throw data into Dune?
I think there's a couple of reasons. I mean, I think the easiest one is like we handle all of the compute and transformations and like the rest of the indexing for them. You know, like I think for companies that don't need to index the blockchain, like Uniswap or Mirror is like you have to index the blockchain because that's mission critical. You know, but if you're Flashbots or whatnot, you could technically just index the mempool, the builder, the proposer, and you don't really have to index everything on chain. But at some point, your business grows to like a stage where you need that extra data. So then it's easier to just upload into Dune and be like, hey, I have this great data that I need to join to everything else. It's much easier to do that on Dune and also leverage Dune's compute and like the rest of like the dashboarding UI tools that we've built specifically for more of like a crypto native audience.
Got it. So it sounds like a pretty symbiotic relationship then.
Yeah. And obviously the wizards all love it, or we call our analysts wizards. But yeah, they all love having the data as well. So you get people to do free work for you, basically. You should pay them, but they basically do free work for you.
That's a conversation for a different day. Are there instances where you have teams that are dumping data that want that data to be private, where they don't want, you know, people to be able to access it?
Yes, yeah. So that's a top request. We're actually shipping that this month. If you're a team that wants to test out private data sets, do reach out to me and let me know. We're working with quite a few teams right now on basically testing that feature out. So that'll be coming out soon.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, I'd imagine this is a hot topic that I don't know that you can actually speak on, but I'd imagine with even some of the CFTC stuff that came out yesterday around linking addresses to IP addresses and things like that, there will be types of data that's actually quite sensitive, but that teams do need to be able to sort of aggregate and run against the more robust types of data that Dune allows you to play with.
100%. And yeah, we plan on testing it ourselves by like moving our own internal analytics into it as well, so that we can, you know, it's easier to manage and make sure security is tighter, especially when it's our own data. Not to say we don't care the same for customer data, but you know,
you're dog fooding privacy.
Exactly.
Sort of.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think this brings us into a really interesting discussion that you and I have had, Andrew, around new types of data more broadly that exist on and off chain and how Dune is thinking about that. So It feels like up until this point, Dune has a pretty robust offering of what types of data you can query on chain and pull. Yep. But as we see things like intents and even ZKPs become a lot closer to actual implementation and adoption, you do start to get these weird dynamics where like, it is no longer true that most data is on chain. And you have these weird, like, intents mempool type things going on that are private. And so I guess at a very high level, we'll dive into the specifics, but at a very high level, I'm curious how you're thinking about navigating these new types of data that maybe don't exist on chain and what that looks like moving forward for Dune.
Yeah, I mean, that's top of mind. That's probably like half my calls. Like this month, we're talking to like different like intent providers or bridges or whatnot, or account abstraction people, just trying to understand how they're thinking about it. Because I think for me, top of mind is just like two new things. One, what is the new data structure of a wallet? And two, what is the new data structure of a transaction? And like, what do I mean there? For a wallet, you don't have just like an EOA and single way of signing anymore. Like it might be a fully on-chain smart contract, like a smart account that has multiple different ways of verifying. It might be nested ownership of smart accounts where like you have an EOA that controls a smart account that might also control another one. I've heard people developing these things more in like the gaming context and like the DAO context. Don't know if it's going to get to implementation, but it's like that's top of mind for me now of like, okay, you have this like one, like I can't just use transaction from anymore to identify a wallet. And two, it's like there's this extra data around wallets that I definitely want to have because it needs to be easy for users on Dune to work with. So that's one data structure. The other one is right now we analyze and index everything based off transaction hash, but intents don't have a transaction hash, you know? And if I do a cross-chain transaction, I technically have multiple transaction hashes now. So then do I use, for example, layer 0, they have a source ID. Do I use the layer 0 ID as the main identifier that then ties down to the two transactions, the one on Optimism and the other one on Ethereum? You know, like, is it a hash of all three? Like, what if we have like actual, like when they say shared sequencing and whatnot, what if you actually have cross-chain transactions that can hop from 4 layers? Or like there's a super chain thing where it goes to this middle bridge and then commits there. But anyway, so like that gets confusing because then I'm like, all right, what's the new transaction hash that I can then base everything else around? So those are probably two of the things that are top of mind, at least for me right now. And there's no easy answer, I think, to either of them. So,
do you anticipate that question will be answered through the adoption of like a successful standard? Do you think it's something where we'll see just like all of the options playing out simultaneously and it's going to make your life hell for a while and then eventually a winner will emerge? Like, how do you anticipate this happening?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I think that's something I don't have a clear opinion on yet. I would obviously prefer the former. I would prefer if people had a standard, but I fully accept that we're in the Wild West and it's definitely almost 99% chance going to be the latter, where like, as I talk to these teams, they're very much just like, we need to like ship out the product. We need to get it going. I think they had all these like account abstraction, MEV, chain, like bridging, whatever, rollups. They had their fun, just tech period already. I think they're now in the brutal go-to-market stage where they're like, oh shit, Optimism is working with Base already. You know, like that's a huge name. If you compete too slowly and like go and try and build a standard for a year and a half, but everyone's already following what Coinbase is doing, you're kind of screwed. So like, I recognize that's like just realistic in this competitive environment. So I'm not bothering them saying, hey, do a standard, otherwise Dune's not going to work with you. But I'm at least trying to angle for like, hey, can we make some sort of consistent, just like one part of it consistent? I don't need it all to be consistent. I just need at least one part to be consistent.
I don't know if it'll answer that question, but I did see this week Safe announced a white paper for, I think they're calling it Safe Protocol, and it's sort of like a collection of account abstraction EIPs and like an implementation of how those might interact. Did you get a chance to read that? Does that seem promising to you?
Yeah, I mean, definitely promising, but I already know of like at least 3 other teams that are working on different implementations. It's kind of interesting, right? Thinking through like, why do standards get created and like what actually, because like I wasn't around when like ERC 721 even came out, you know, like I think that was like 2017. I maybe went to some finance conference where someone talked about CryptoKitties and whatnot, but like, I don't really know what went down there. And I don't know how they got to adoption of that standard. For something like account abstraction, like ERC 4337, I can see why people had to do a standard, because you have to have a standard for infrastructure providers to build around. You have to have a standard for like Alchemy and Biconomy and like StackUp and all of these other providers to build onto. But for some of these things, like how the smart accounts are then stacked, that feels more like an application level decision. And like they can stack it however they want, and it doesn't change how like Alchemy or Biconomy or whatnot will set up their infra. So they don't need to have a standard to then get everyone else's buy-in. They can just move on their own. In that case, I don't know if we'll see a standard come up.
That's kind of an interesting call out in the context of when you need standardized data or standardized implementations on the infrastructure side, it's very straightforward and obvious that you need to be architecting whatever it is you're building for that. It's the analytics side of things is interesting because it's always after the fact. And so while you might need standardization in order to understand what the fuck's going on, you have not implemented it because it's a later me problem. You know, it's like, I'll punt that down the line. We'll figure that out. And of course, Andrew, you're dealing with everyone's later problems.
Yep. Yeah.
Which is just kind of a wild dynamic.
We're at the bottom of the food chain. I think, it applies especially so to like even data availability and whatnot. Everyone's like, oh yeah, we're going to post these proofs and all these different DA layers is going to get pruned in like 2 weeks to 30 days. And literally, like, if you look at Celestia's docs, they're kind of just like, oh yeah, we handle the publishing part, the storage, not our problem. Go use any libp2p, like, but they don't even mention Filecoin or Arweave or any of these. So my assumption is like, they're probably not even focusing on building that, so I'm like, all right, if I don't go and index this now, like, I just have to kind of hope some random degen out there, like Solo Hacker, is indexing it just for fun, that we can get the data later. I don't know. Like, I think it applies to all these new data sources. It's like, all right, yeah, I don't know who's storing this, who's setting the standards. It's a mess.
Yeah, I imagine it's a scenario where, like, the lower you go in the stack, the more incentive there is to cooperate versus compete. Like, the most successful protocol or infrastructure tool will be the one that is like most interoperable and most other people are using it. Whereas, like, the higher you go in the stack, the more teams are just like, I want to ship. I'm not worried about anyone like cooperating with me. In fact, like, other people that are working on this, I see them as competition. So yeah, I guess you get to deal with the full brunt of like the entire stack, being that you are like a more general data aggregator. I don't know, how does that feel?
Yeah. I mean, there's a world where I just say, hey, if you're Uniswap or whatnot and you're doing all this Uniswap X stuff, I'm just going to trust that you will upload this data at some point and like, you're going to handle this, and like, there's no point in us trying to force some sort of aggregation of it. I think at some point you always end up with aggregation eventually. It's just all this early data, we're probably not going to have it. Like, I think for like bridges and stuff, like I think the team is like Socket something. I think they just announced a raise where they're trying to be like a bridge aggregator. So I'm assuming in that case, I could just go to them. And like, I am going to be talking with, I think, one of their founders soon, just to kind of be like, hey, since you're aggregating, can you go ahead and just standardize it as well?
Yeah. Well, it's like they're incentivized too, I imagine. And so it's a good place where you can hopefully lean on them.
Yeah, because I think we saw this a lot with just aggregators in general when it came to like DEX aggregation. Like, I think, at least on Dune, like a lot of like the best models and like best help we got was from like 0x and like 1inch on CowSwap, and building these like great aggregated models that have all the needed metadata. So maybe the same thing here, but I don't know. It's hard.
I want to ask a little bit about zero knowledge proofs and how the sort of like privacy chain future is going to affect Dune as well. Like, we had a conversation with Aztec about their privacy side of their L2, and I imagine that just completely changes the sort of analytics that you can do if you can even do any analytics. So yeah, like, how are the Dune team thinking about like zero knowledge proof, like privacy specific ZKPs?
Right. I think that one's hard. I would say that's probably lower on our list because I think it's kind of one of those things you look at it. It's just like, there's not much we can do. I don't even really know how decodable some of these ZK proofs are. There might be some things where like they post the proof, but the actual data for it is still available somewhere. But if you're completely being like a privacy chain, I don't really know what we can do there. I know we have some conversations with ZK Sync going and whatnot, but that's mainly been out of my realm. Like, yeah. I think it's interesting, but yeah, I honestly don't know what we can do there from like an analytics perspective.
Yeah, there's only so much you can really glean from like the number of transactions or like just the metadata surrounding the transaction without being able to like see into it at all. So I guess that makes your life more complicated.
Yeah, I'm ignoring your friend. That's like the highest technical barrier because I'm also like, I barely understand ZK proofs. So I'm like, all right, I know what a recursive proof is and like something about folding that sounds like protein folding, but applies to proofs. And that's basically the limit.
I mean, I guess there is kind of an interesting dynamic here. I think both in the ZKP instance, but also in the conversation around intents and things like Uniswap X, where it's like, and this is a little bit more philosophical, so we won't go too deep down this rabbit hole, but like, to what degree do projects who are privacy preserving or who are off chain, like with Uniswap X, to what degree do they have a responsibility to make that data available, particularly in the context of, just because it's on chain and settled doesn't necessarily mean that it does not need to be public. In the sense of like, accountability is kind of an important element of crypto more broadly and things that are on chain. And so there is kind of an interesting philosophical question here, which is that, privacy preserving chains are really important. And, projects that have no public data also have very little accountability and very little ability for people to actually understand what's going on. So there's kind of a weird dynamic there.
Yeah. I mean, I think the privacy chain side, their incentive is just to keep things purely private. There's no part where it is centralized besides like maybe the RPC provider. And like, that's something they're just going to have to figure out. I think with like stuff like what Uniswap X is doing, I don't know. There's layers to it. Their RFQ system of like the quotes that are being submitted, like that's off chain. Should that be public or not? I think that depends more on like regulatory than anything else. I would imagine at some point a regulator is going to be like, yeah, your quoting system has to be tracked somewhere. And like, if not fully public, it has to be at least reported to like NYFRB or something like that. But I know that they're also working like a gossip network. Like they held a happy hour a few weeks ago, and they're going to have this kind of node system where anyone can run a node and like take quotes and work with solvers and whatnot. I assume CowSwap probably does the same thing. So that's closer to like a mempool structure. So it will be public in a sense. So yeah, TLDR, I think for stuff like what Uniswap X is doing, they'll create some way of accessing the data, whether it's because of regulatory or just like to scale the system.
That makes sense. So I want to zoom back out to the beginning of the Dune portion of the conversation when we talked about Dune as like an SQL interface to on-chain data. It sounds like you've been doing some work with GPT and trying to abstract that to a degree that even non-SQL developers can start to get at that data, and even like non-developers. So can you talk a little bit about what you've been doing at the intersection of on-chain analytics and AI?
Yeah, LLMs are very fun. I think the TLDR is that they're great to use. They're horrible to develop with. I don't think I've met a single person that actually likes building like a GPT plugin. Like it's great to use. And then everyone's like, oh yeah, this is amazing. Go build another one. I'm like, no, you don't understand. Like, I feel like I was having an argument with a child. And then like you switch from GPT 3.5 to GPT 4 and it's like the child kind of grew up, but then some of the things the child learned, the child forgot. It's a whole mess. But yeah, I think we have three main features for it. And this is all thanks to our great data scientist, Megan. She's been working on like there's create, there's edit, and there's debug. Edit and debug are a little quote unquote easier because debug is just like you give it an error message and it's pretty good about figuring out what's wrong. If you tell it, hey, this line has this error, GPT gets pretty focused on like, oh yeah, I know to only really look at this line. Edit's a little harder. You have to be pretty specific about like, hey, I want to add this table with this column and like do a cumulative sum. But it still has most, assuming the query is written logically and things are named well, then it's pretty good at editing. Create's very hard. Like we've had the LLM feature live for over a few months now. I mean, nothing against our users, but like people suck at asking questions. I think this is just normal, like across the board. Like I'm sure anyone at Google who looks at what gets searched probably laughs all the time because they're like, wait, you can't search for this. So I think the bridge to gap is like, all right, like people have these intuitive searches they want to make. How do we make that easier for them? Like, do we try to bridge the gap completely on the GPT side where like the user can still submit anything? We just try and like decision tree it on the back end, or like, do we force tighter guidelines? In which case, like the LLM thing starts to become more like a no-code SQL builder where it's like, oh yeah, you have to fill out these 3 fields or whatnot. But at that point, you might as well just build a no-code SQL builder. So I think that's like a very tough balance. As something we're working on actively. It's also hard when like there's over 1 million tables that you can query. And like with people's uploaded data and all of that, then it gets even more confusing to do. Yeah, I don't know if you have a specific question there. Point
Yeah,
is,
no, I mean, this is already a good conversation. First, it's interesting to hear. I haven't had a chance to write anything in terms of like a GPT plugin, so it's interesting to hear that perspective. I imagine it's like you're basically crafting what is ultimately the equivalent of the like Chat GPT, like plain text prompt. But to your point, there's such a learning curve with knowing how to write a query that GPT will be able to help you with. Like having used GPT now for as long as it's been out as like a programming assistant, you learn the way that you phrase the question is so important. If you say something like, how do I do this thing? It assumes that like this thing is totally possible, and it like goes from there. And when you have like hundreds of tables and data sources, I imagine that it gets even more complicated. Is it a scenario where it's like you described this decision tree, you take their query and maybe you can like try to parse out what it is that they're trying to get at and then maybe feed that into GPT? Is there a scenario where like you replace the decision tree with like another query to GPT where you like let GPT decision tree it, or does that get too messy, or what does that look like?
Caveat again, I'm not the one specifically building this. I'm helping giving input on it and like helping with some of the design choices. We have not landed on like a perfect solution either, so this is definitely subject to change. I think it's easier to like do something like, and like natural language processing has something called part-to-speech tagging. So just tagging like, okay, if it's a proper noun, like, is this a token? Is this a contract? Is it something else? Is it an ENS name? You know, like first step is kind of just like trying to figure that kind of stuff out, which I think is still easier to do in a parts of speech method. Because if you ask GPT, hey, what is Uniswap? It's not very accurate. And like the data is still outdated because like I think GPT is still like 2021 limited. So like I don't think it knows what V3 really is. So I think for stuff like that, like it's just easier to build it in like a custom format.
Yeah, like you know more about the context of what your user is trying to get at than GPT might.
Yeah, and you also have the extra complexity of like the biggest. Can you guess what the biggest user issue with these LLMs are? What do you think they run into the most? What do you think they're most frustrated about?
I don't know. Chase?
I'm trying to think about what they would be trying to do.
It's got to be stuff like, I'm just trying to go like lowest common denominator thought of like trying to find the most like active on-chain pump and dump like shit coins or something along those lines, or am I way off?
I think I maybe phrased the question wrong. Like I was trying to think through like more of like when they're trying to go through the product, what frustrates them the most. And like they do, a lot of people do ask like about shitcoins, like that does happen a lot. But it's actually, the problem is not like making the query run or making the query accurate. It's the latency of the response. GPT is still really slow. So getting the GPT to actually respond within like 5 seconds or something is basically impossible. So if like, even in the case where asking GPT, hey, what is Uniswap? Even if GPT works perfectly there, that adds like 5 more seconds of latency because that's an extra conversation that has to happen. Versus if we hard code it in decision tree, we can make it happen in like milliseconds, you know? So like that's an extra layer of consideration for all of these things of like, all right, I can make an LLM product that works perfectly through a continuous like self-debugging like auto GPT system, but does the like user really want to wait 60 seconds for an output? I don't think so. Like users are very, very impatient in general. It doesn't matter if you're technical, non-technical, whatnot. If you see something's loading for 60 seconds, guaranteed you've clicked off, you've gone elsewhere, your context is gone. So that's also really hard to build with.
It's funny because you get to a similar problem that we were talking about around Mirror, which is like, build an additional system. But the problem with that is that you can't build an additional system because you don't actually know the answer. Like on-chain latency is not easy, but it's easier in the sense that you can basically lie to a user for a short period of time and then renege on whatever it is that you said. It is much harder to do that in the context of Chat GPT, where you're actually, or GPT integrated into applications, because the user is prompting for a response that is actually much more complicated than, their initial prompt.
Yeah, yeah. Everything's any non-deterministic system becomes very hard to like continuously build on top of. So
Yes,
which is
yes.
why we have blockchains.
Which becomes actually interesting in the context of, I think, as we're closing out some of this conversation, it does feel like the sheer amount of data on chain lends itself very well to GPT enabled applications. Then you get into some of these questions around like, okay, how long do these things take, and how like accurate is the response and synthesis of GPT actually going to be in some of these contexts. And I guess Dune kind of sits in the middle there, where it's labeling and making sense of data, and then GPT is sort of an interface between an end user and Dune itself. But it does make me wonder, like, what other types of infrastructure need to emerge to make sense of some of these pieces of data. And is Dune sort of going to be the end all be all? Or are we going to have other, I guess, more modular pieces of infrastructure for data synthesis and understanding to plug into this more modular stack?
Yeah, I think there definitely will be a more modular layer. I think Dune cannot capture every context. Like, it's impossible for us to write the DeFi context and the NFT context and like the perpetuals context and the multi-chain. Like, that's just not, I don't think it's really going to happen. I think there's a world. I mean, we do have like a CRUD API where people can write. Basically, you can write your query to an API. You don't have to write it inside of Dune. I think like there's some great companies out there like Artemis.xyz. They're focused on like mainly like the financial analyst perspective. I can see them building like a finance focused LLM on top of Dune. And that would do better than anything we could build, because if we build it with that specific audience, we're now like not serving, I don't know, like 70% of our customers, 80%, if we're only focusing on the finance focused ones. So yeah, I definitely see that modular layer coming out, but not in a way where their LLM talks to our LLM. I don't think it's going to look like that. I think it's going to just be separate, like integration style for now.
We'll have aggregation of LLMs at some layer. We'll just, the aggregation layers.
That's
it's all
a separate
aggregation
issue.
all the way down.
Yeah. My context is maxed out.
Max aggregation all the time is kind of the TLDR of that. I mean, it is kind of like the whole bundling and unbundling thing, except for it's happening in different layers of the stack. But that's sort of a whole other ordeal. One thing that Kevin and I were talking about and we're curious about, one of the things that I think is most interesting about Dune is that it is created by people who are like relatively more technical, or do dashboards. At least you need to be relatively technical to create, but it's consumed by people who are not necessarily very technical at all. And so very curious about any advice you might have for people who are more technical listeners that interface with sort of like less technical team members, and how, if you have any tips for sort of making that communication more effective in the context of Dune or outside of it, and sort of abstracting away some of the complexity.
Yeah, I think a lot of that is on the Dune team and Dune product to do. We've heard this feedback from a lot of our customers where like the analysts will make crazy dashboards and crazy queries, and like they're really good, and they might even get a lot of like community usage, like outside of team usage. But it's still hard to get a team, especially the non-technical people who are like not familiar with Dune, not familiar with the queries, have like a lower attention span. It's hard to get them to keep coming back and like keep getting value, and like I think this is like an analytics problem in general. It doesn't just sit in crypto. Like I think Tableau and all these like Mode and Hex and all these other companies face the same issue of like, if you have someone technical creating something, they're going to create way too much content than what's useful. I'm guilty of the same thing internally and externally. So I think, yeah, that's something we're actively thinking through. There's not, honestly, it pains me to say, there's not much advice I can give to the technical people besides like, if someone asks you a question, just go and answer that question. Don't surface like the 10 things you did on the way there and like the 10 extra insights. I think this is a mistake analysts make in general, is like someone will be like, oh, hey, what's our retention of like X users? And they'll go and do like 9 cohorts and split it by different personas and whatnot. And it's like, yes, that will eventually be interesting to see that your retention of like airdrop hunters is higher than retention of like, I don't know, other users. But like, you can't throw people into the like 9 levels deep right away. Like you have to first show them like, hey, here's the most basic chart, and then slowly like nerd snipe them on the rest of it. If you present all of it at once, like if you have a dashboard that's like 30 charts deep or something, like no, I promise you, no one is going to come back to it. It doesn't matter how, like the insights might be amazing, but like people have very short attention spans. But yeah, Dune, we are working on making that easier. We've honestly like shifted our mission from just like the data must flow or like the revolution will not be reported quarterly to more like, like our job is to make crypto data accessible to everyone, not just like the people who can write SQL and spend all their day on Twitter and Etherscan and all that, because most people do not want to do that with their lives.
Weird.
Yeah,
Who would have
weird. But yeah.
We've got a couple minutes left. I wanted to do a quick lightning round. These are all going to be kind of questions about Dune, about dashboards that you've seen. First question, what is the most interesting dashboard that you've seen? Maybe recently. I'm sure you've seen a lot over time.
The most interesting it still has to be like Hildeby's staking dashboard. I think the staking data is still very interesting, and that's something I look at fairly often. I'll also shill my own dashboard. I made a dashboard covering every single ERC standard. I think a lot of people come in and try to read contracts and like go ground up, but if you spend time looking at the standards, you'll have a much better time. So
very cool. Yeah, I think you had just recently tweeted about that. I looked through that dashboard. That was kind of neat to look at.
Yeah.
All right, next one. The most cursed dashboard that you've seen.
Oh, let's see. We have way too many airdrop dashboards. I get it. They do well on Twitter, but please go deeper than just creating an airdrop dashboard. The data can be used for a lot more than that.
Okay, that makes sense.
I'm not going to name out a specific one, but I'm just going to say I'm going to like it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Let's try and be more creative than that.
Yeah.
What about what's like one data query that you did that made you think that it must be wrong, but then it turned out to be right? Just some sort of surprising thing.
I mean, honestly, like I think Solana gets a bad rap a lot for like their active user metrics being like overstated. Like I've looked into them and split it in different ways. And I'm like, honestly, like they have just as many DeFi users as Ethereum does. Like noting that like Ethereum apps get like, like honestly 40 to 100 or maybe 200 users a week, which is not that much, but like they're not like pumping their stats or anything. The data there is actually like pretty good. So that surprised me a while, like maybe in March. So I've done a lot more research in Solana in the last 7 months or so, which I know is like taboo in the Ethereum world, but I'm like, all right, it's worth paying some attention to, I would say.
Yeah, I wonder if it's a scenario where like earlier on, I remember seeing a tweet thread about like the main Solana DEX where the traffic was like continuous and then the DEX went down, it went back up, and then and a couple hours passed with zero usage. And then someone tweeted and was like, hey, LOL, looks like they forgot to turn back on like the fake traffic bot. And within 3 minutes, all the traffic went right back up to like consistent. This was like very early days. So I do wonder how much of that has changed with like maybe there was some shenanigans earlier on.
Yes.
And maybe it's like less accurate now.
Activity's definitely dropped like a lot, but I think that holds for all chains. So I'm sure there's still I'm sure that still exists, but like if they're only getting like 200, 300 users, I don't think like if someone's trying to pump the stats there, they're not trying hard enough.
Sure. Okay. And last question.
Too bad to be lying, basically.
Yeah. I'm like, if you're lying about 300 users, I'm like, I don't think you understand how this market works.
All right. Last question, unless Chase has any others. What is one interesting tool, pattern, or library that devs might learn from today, or even just more broadly, like tool that would make their lives easier that they can leverage?
I think the tool that's been on my mind to try, and it's on my list. I know it's good, but like the whole like WAGMI and like VM package system that like Tom and Jake have built out, I know is a lot easier and better to work with than some of the older packages in the ecosystem. And it's been on my list to go and build a project with that. But On the data side, obviously I'm biased and I only use Dune for the most part, but you should check out, I think Storm has like a cryo package on GitHub that I've also heard great things about. So if you aren't using Dune, then okay, go use cryo.
We're full Dune maxi mode. And I think we're going to be having Tom and Jake on the pod. Of course. We'll be having Tom and Jake on the pod to talk WAGMI as well soon. So
oh, cool. Amazing. Yeah.
The shill is leading us beautifully into the next episode.
Great.
But Andrew, this was so fun to have you on the pod. Where can people learn more about you and the work that you're doing at Dune?
Yeah, I mean, easiest is Twitter, obviously, Andrew Hong, 5297. It's dumb enough to put my birthday, but I'm stuck with it now. I'm on Twitter, and then I write a Substack, Web3 Data Degens, where I put longer form content covering things like the modular stack or account abstraction or other data tips. So go subscribe there as well.
Beautiful. Andrew, thanks so much for coming on the show. This was so fun to jam.
Appreciate it, Andrew.
Yeah, no, it was great. Great questions.